Good evening, everyone. A very warm welcome to a very, very warm and muggy welcome to you all to St Peter's this evening for the final lecture in our 2022 series for the Contemporary Theology Group. We've added on an extra lecture this year because of the fact that we've got the Lambeth Conference coming in about 10 days' time or something or other, where Canterbury will be so full of bishops that everyone will be walking diagonally as a result. So we wanted to have something to help reflect upon the nature of ecumenism, and we asked Jonathan Husser, who's the Secretary of the Methodist Conference, to come and talk with us about the issue of Anglican-Methodist unity. Jonathan has been the Secretary of Conference for several years now, and basically in Methodism, the more Stalinist your job title, the more important you are. So Secretary of Conference sounds quite threatening and intimidating, but Jonathan, I'm sure, won't be any of that this evening. We are really pleased to have you here, Jonathan. Thank you so much. Jonathan was the Vice-Principal at Wesley House and had to suffer being my tutor for a year. So I do apologise for everything that happened in those years. But it's lovely to have you here this evening to talk with us and share with us your thoughts around the potential future for Anglican-Methodist unity and dialogue. So I'll hand over to you now, but thank you, Jonathan.
Can you hear me now? Right. So again, thank you very much for those words of welcome, and be assured what happened at Wesley House stays at Wesley House. Even the milk and the motor car. There's Peter Ustinov, the late actor and writer, was a great raconteur. He used to tell a story about when he was driving around Switzerland, and he told about how on one occasion he came along the road to a bridge, and as he was coming towards the bridge there was a sign that said that the bridge was closed, and in front of him it was quite clear that the bridge was not closed, and a policeman was standing there. So Peter Ustinov stopped and he said to the policeman, "I don't understand this, is the bridge closed or is it not?" And the policeman said, "Oh, the bridge is more recent than the sign." I tell you that because the title of the lecture this evening has changed. The fact is that the lecture is more recent than the advertisement that you saw. I'm now calling this Under One Roof, Anglicans and Methodists in the Future. Because I'm doing that because you might have heard that the Methodist Church in Britain is on the move. That is to say, we are changing our address. From September the 1st, we will no longer be officially at 25 Marylebone Road. In London, it will be at 25 Tavistock Square. There's a number of reasons for this move, not least that the connectional team, that is those who work in our central services to support the life of the church, the connectional team is smaller than it was. Ways of working have changed and were changing even before COVID-19 hit. And the Methodist Council concluded that it was better not to invest more money in the current Methodist Church House, but to look for a smaller and more manageable property as the home for the team. However, 25 Tavistock Place, to which we're going, also needs some investment to make it fit for purpose. This is going to be, I am promised, a modern office building designed for ecclesiastical purposes with net zero carbon footprint and full access to those with disabilities and a big desk for the Secretary of the Conference. But because it needs work doing, and we've already bought it, though we'll leave Marylebone Road in October, we're not likely to take up residence in Tavistock Place until January of 2024. In the interim, we will be guests of Church House Westminster. The Church House Trust has offered us a floor in their refurbished building in Dean's Yard, where the offices of the Church of England are. For 15 months or so then, members of the Methodist Connectional team will be operating in proximity to their Anglican opposite numbers, in a proximity that we have not known before, until the time comes for us finally to move to Tavistock Place. And so we're wondering, what will the fruits of this proximity be? Will the chance encounter in the lift spark new cooperation? Will being able to pop down a floor for a chat cause us to think more ecumenically? Will the opportunity to pray together engender a new desire for unity? And will we come to regret, as some think we might, that the cohabitation is to be short-lived and not the precursor to the marriage of two denominations' support structures? Putting the office of the Secretary of the Conference in the vicinity of the office of the General Secretary of the Archbishop's Council is not the same as bringing together two Christian churches. Of course it's not. Though it's interesting to note in passing that one of the signs of progress in the 2005 interim report on the implementation of the Anglican-Methodist Covenant was that two Methodist districts had their administration housed in Anglican diocesan offices. But it does seem to me that the locations of the Methodist Church in Britain's office over the next 2 years might give us some imagery to think about where we're heading as churches. I ask you to forgive me if this seems somewhat contrived. What I hope to do is to try to stimulate some thinking for our conversation. I'm aware, and who could not be, that this is a warm evening, and that sometimes on warm evenings, minds wander and even eyes close. So forgive the spoiler alert, just so nobody misses out where this is going, let me set out my position, my conclusion indeed, from the outset. I'm speaking to you as the Secretary of the Methodist Conference, which is a partner in one of the dialogues exploring Anglican-Methodist unity, and the one to which we'll give some attention this evening. I'm also speaking in a personal capacity as someone who believes that Anglican-Methodist union is not only an important aspiration, but is frankly overdue. We are considering these matters at a point in the story where, and I don't think it's controversial to say this, the dialogue seems to have got stuck. And I want to consider why that might be. And I want also to own both my hope that we can find a way forward over the next few years, and to suggest some of the questions that the Methodist Church needs to address for that to happen. Others, other Methodists indeed, and those from other denominations might have different perspectives, and we hope we'll hear those in the conversation that follows. So let's think a bit about Anglican-Methodist unity and the prospect of it as we plot the peregrinations of the Methodist Church office over the next 18 months. And we're starting here, at Methodist Church House in Marylebone Road. Or at least, as it's still called by many people, Mission House. This building was built in the 1940s. It actually started just before 1939 and then left for a while. It was used during the war by the BBC. But after the war, it became the Mission House of the Methodist Church in Britain, the headquarters of the Methodist Missionary Society and latterly of the Methodist Church's Overseas Division. In 1996, the Methodist Church had a reorganisation. It abolished its 7 divisions and relocated some of those other functions from Westminster and from the Guy Chester Centre at Muswell Hill into Marylebone Road, and renamed Mission House Methodist Church House. That change happened as part of a time of change between essentially the 1930s and the 1990s into the noughties of this century. A time of change that saw the end of what had been the overseas districts of the British Methodist Church. Most of them, by the time of 1996, most of them had become autonomous conferences. The last to do so was Gambia in 2009. But still, a decade more after the last of the autonomous conferences came into being, and 25 years after it ceased to be Mission House, this was still a place that was revered by those who had an interest, a particular interest, in the global Methodist family. Mission partners who were sent overseas were commissioned at 25 Marylebone Road. Often, visitors from overseas districts or overseas Methodist conferences would come for meetings at 25 Marylebone Road. And Mission House stood as a reminder of the overseas missions activity of the 1800s, but always, broadly speaking, of two traditions of Methodist mission activity. Those missions that were sponsored by the Methodist Church in Great Britain, and those missions that were sponsored by the Methodist Church in the United States of America. And the result of all that missionary activity throughout the 19th and early 20th century was a complex worldwide Methodist family of, I think, 77 conferences and some united or uniting churches, and approximately 80 million people worldwide who would call themselves Methodist. From 1881, representatives of the different Methodist churches around the world came together in what was later to be known as the World Methodist Council. The World Methodist Council now hosts a World Methodist Conference every 5 years, and it describes its mission as being fourfold. The World Methodist Council exists to connect Christians of Methodist and Wesleyan traditions throughout the world, and to do so particularly with an eye to the heritage that we share. So, for example, one of the World Methodist Council's work is in the Old Rectory at Epworth. It exists, secondly, to spread the good news of Jesus Christ through World Methodist evangelism. So it has projects to equip Methodists to talk about their faith. It exists to work for reconciliation, to foster community, and to promote peace. And it offers a World Methodist Peace Prize. And you may have seen that Inderjit Bogle, former president of the Methodist Conference, was awarded that Peace Prize only recently, but it was actually the 2018 award. And it works for the unity of Christ's Church. And the World Methodist Council also sponsors the work of the Methodist Ecumenical Office in Rome. But Methodism was not the only denomination that was active in mission during the 19th century. There was Anglican missionary activity around the world, and that results, as I don't need to tell you, in a city that's soon to host the Lambeth Conference, in a family of churches, the Anglican Communion. From 1867 onwards, the gathering of bishops as the Lambeth Conference has been occurring approximately every 10 years. And I hope I've got this bit right. As I understand it, the Anglican Communion is a family of, I think, 46 autocephalous churches or provinces or extra-provincials. Counting Christian denominations worldwide is notoriously difficult, but it also seems that there are approximately 80 million Anglicans worldwide. And like the World Methodist Council, the Anglican Communion claims that it is working for the broader unity of Christ's Church. So when we talk about Anglicans and Methodists and we look beyond these shores, what we see are two worldwide churches, approximately of the same size, each claiming allegiance, if I've done my sums correctly, of approximately 1% of the world's population, both broadly in the same tradition of Western Reformed Christianity, both committed to the ecumenical endeavour, one of which was born out of the other in very roughly the last 250 years. And it's therefore surprising that formal dialogue between those two global bodies has only occurred over the last 30 years. That dialogue was born out of the Lambeth Conference of 1988. It resulted in meetings of representatives of the two bodies in the Anglican-Methodist International Commission between 1992 and 1996, and that commission produced a report in 1996 called Sharing in the Apostolic Communion. The intention was that that report would be studied widely. It wasn't proposing some sort of union at a global level, but it offered tools for bilateral dialogue, for national churches to liaise with each other in forming a path towards unity. And that really was where the 1998 Lambeth Conference left it. This points to some of the complexity about this whole matter. What's meant by national is not always the same. The dialogue here actually is a good example of that. We're going to look later at what we call the Anglican-Methodist covenant, but strictly speaking is a covenant between the Methodist Church in Britain and the Church of England. And notice the asymmetry that's already there. In other places around the world, different Methodist traditions, for example in the United States, live with multiple Methodist identities. There'll be more than one Methodist church in a nation. Particularly that's true in the United States, where the legacy of slavery is still evident in the different bodies. In some parts of the world, there is actually competition in missionary activity between those American and British Methodist traditions. The Anglican-Methodist dialogue internationally was paused after the 1998 Lambeth Conference, but it was picked up again in 2009 by a new body, the Anglican-Methodist International Commission on Unity and Mission. One of the things about ecumenical dialogue, some of you will already be aware, is the longer it goes on, the longer the acronyms and the names of the bodies tends to become. Amicum reported in 2014. It noted that sharing the Apostolic Communion had not been as widely studied as its authors had hoped, and therefore there was still much work on bilateral conversations to be done. The 2014 report of Amicum was entitled Into All the World. As before, it recognised the great deal that the two worldwide communions hold in common, reflected at length on the history of the two denominations and on their approach to unity. And it drew deeply on the Lambeth Quadrilateral as it was presented in 1920. The Lambeth Quadrilateral sets out 4 areas that are common to churches of the Anglican Communion. They are the Holy Scriptures of the Old and New Testament as containing all things necessary to salvation and being the rule and ultimate standard of faith. Secondly, the Apostles' Creed as the baptismal symbol and the Nicene Creed as the sufficient statement of the Christian faith. Thirdly, the 2 sacraments ordained by Christ himself, baptism and the supper of the Lord, ministered with unfailing use of Christ's words of institution and of the elements ordained by him. And lastly, the historic episcopate, locally adapted in the methods of its administration to the varying needs of the nations and peoples called of God into the unity of God's church. Bible, creeds, sacrament, historic episcopate. What Anglicans have in common, and what I think Anglicans could not let go. The ecumenical dialogue in many places has developed from that effectively 4 components for unity. And these are actually commonly accepted in a lot of ecumenical conversations that have gone on over the last century. You'll see the similarities. That in order for churches to come together, we recognise that there's likely to need to be common confession of apostolic faith, common baptism and a single Eucharist, common interchangeable ministry of word and sacrament, and a common ministry of oversight, or episcopae. Again and again, these conversations come to a point where we talk about bishops. Now, forgive me if this is familiar to you, but it's so central that I'm going to try to rehearse what I understand the issue to be. The Anglican-Methodist dialogue is between 2 Christian traditions that have different understandings about bishops. That is not to say that Methodists worldwide do not have bishops. Many, indeed I think most Methodist churches throughout the world do have bishops, and they have different patterns of bishops, as indeed Anglican churches have differing expressions of the episcopate. If you go to Nigeria, for instance, they have archbishops and even a prelate who presides over their conference. But the key question in all this is around what we call the historic episcopate. And roughly, and somebody will no doubt correct me in the questions afterwards if I've got this wrong, but roughly, the historic episcopate means that a bishop is a symbol of the continuity of the church's tradition. He or she will have been ordained by 3 other bishops. More, those bishops will themselves all be part of a threefold ministry. A bishop will previously have been a priest and ordained by a bishop and a number of priests into that office of priest or presbyter. And before that, he or she will have been a deacon and ordained to that office by a bishop. And the unity of the church, from the view of the historic episcopate, is not bringing together different strands into something new. It's about reconciling divided parts of Christ's body into the historic continuity of what has gone before. And acceptance of the historic episcopate is a sign of that. As Paul Avis, the distinguished Anglican ecclesiologist, puts it, the threefold ministry of bishop, priest and deacon is frankly a non-negotiable platform for Anglicanism in ecumenical conversations. The Anglican Communion believes it's historical, believes that it is held in common with many other churches, and believes that the historic episcopate is a feature, an essential feature of that threefold ministry. And as we'll see, actually, the Methodist Church does not quarrel with that perspective. What you'll notice of those 4 components of unity, actually the second and the third rather depend on the fourth. If the key thing is the pattern of episcopal oversight, you can't have interchangeable ministry if you don't have recognizable episcopal oversight. The Eucharist is a sign of unity, but if the way in which the priest or presbyter or minister at the table is authorized is not compatible with that form of oversight, then it's not a sign of unity. So if there's no common understanding of ministry, can you really talk about one Eucharist? Now, I don't want to misrepresent the Anglican position here. Anglicans are quite clear that those churches that don't have the sign of the historic episcopate are churches. Our presbyters, I'd say to Methodists, are presbyters, but they're not interchangeable with presbyters ordained within the historic episcopate. We may think that the first point of those 4 is less contentious. The key thing, interestingly, about the historic episcopate from Irenaeus, the historic episcopate really finds its root in the writings of Irenaeus in the 2nd century. Irenaeus was the first person to record the importance of tracing a line of bishops back. And the reason he did that was because he argued that that line of bishop was a guarantor of orthodoxy, that the true faith was being passed on, and you could see the true faith had been passed on because you could trace the line of bishops. No doubt, Methodists and Anglicans, even though Methodists do not have the sign of the historic episcopate, are both faithful to the teaching of the apostles. Well, yes, but I just want to put down a marker here, and I'm just going to put down a marker and leave it. I don't think we should necessarily take that for granted in future discussions. I would say that we don't doubt. Officially, we have never doubted that the Church of England and the Methodist Church, the Anglican Communion and the World Methodist Church share a common faith. Of course, in both traditions, the Bible is central. Both traditions give the Nicene and Apostle Creeds the pride of place in the liturgies of both churches. At least we say we do. There's no doubt in any official dialogue that both traditions are orthodox, But I was interested to read an article by an American Episcopalian priest who asked, if the creeds are so important to Methodists, why do they never say them? Why week by week in Methodist churches do the congregation skip over the creeds? Why is there nowhere that he can imagine where day by day Methodists say the Apostles' Creed as they do in cathedrals? It's a fair point. Our traditional answer has always been to say the creeds are not the only way in which the apostolic faith is affirmed. As we've seen, the reading of Scripture is central to both traditions. The apostolic faith is expressed through preaching, and that both churches have systems by which only licensed people are permitted to preach, and where there are even authorized sermons, the authorized homilies of the Church of England, the sermons of John Wesley in the Methodist tradition. More, we would say, our liturgy carries our belief, though some Anglicans point out that liturgy is not prescribed in the Methodist tradition. And hymnody does. As long as Methodists are singing Charles Wesley, it's quite clear that we are proclaiming our apostolic faith. The problem might come if we're not singing Charles Wesley any longer. Now, I don't think it's a major issue, but I do think it's one that we need to watch. We can't assume in an ecumenical dialogue that we are seen to remain faithful if that's naturally not people's experience when they worship with us. And it's come to light with a major question that's tearing apart both our traditions, the question of human sexuality. Within limits, we know, all Christian churches know, that we have to live sometimes with contradictory interpretations of a common faith. But if the basis of common faith isn't agreed, then you can have doubts about whether the people to whom you're talking are those with whom you should be talking for doctrinal reasons. I've said it's not at this stage. I don't think it's going to be a major issue, but some voices in past discussions and others in the future would cause us to mean that it needs attention. If we're serious about unity, then, we have to be serious about the content of our faith, and we have to be careful about the way in which we proclaim the content of our faith. We also have to note that the World Methodist Council itself is in a difficult position now. The largest Methodist denomination worldwide is the United Methodist Church. The structure of the United Methodist Church, unlike the Methodist Church in Britain, has to maintain a global unity. So there are United Methodist churches in North America, in Africa, and in other parts of the world. And they come together every 4 years in a general conference. I say every 4 years. I think the last was 2016. And then there was a major division on human sexuality. The majority, largely Africans, but also North Americans, voted to retain the traditional teaching. And now the World Methodist family faces something of a schism. A body called the Global Methodist Church coming into being, joining together those who are in opposition to the position held by others in the United Methodist Church. And there are discussions going on about what that might mean legally and financially. In some way, it's a mirror of the dispute that has been tearing at the Anglican Communion since the ordination of Gene Robinson as a bishop nearly 20 years ago. So what we have, in summary, are globally two Christian traditions that have spoken to each other, but with whom I think it likely that internal arguments are going to hamper future debates. But, as the Amicum report itself noticed, debates at the global level are not the key. It's the series of bilateral conversations that are going to matter. How far will those conversations go? And therefore, I think, we can go from Mission House to Westminster. The signing of the Anglican-Methodist Covenant in 2003 took place at Methodist Central Hall Westminster and was followed by a service in Westminster Abbey, both in the presence of Her Majesty the Queen. In two large buildings that represent the two traditions, and represent also something of the contribution that each has made to the life of the nation. It's worth remembering the journey to that moment in 2003. Different historians will start in different places, but I hope you're going to allow me to start in 1946. We always knew this was going to be about the historic episcopate. And Archbishop Geoffrey Fisher, in the Cambridge sermon, invited the Free Churches in 1946 to take episcopacy into their system. Methodist Church in Britain was the only one of the Free Churches that formally responded positively. And that led, as I'm sure you're aware, to a series of conversations and to a scheme for unity. Like all conversations, it had to find its way through this central issue of episcopacy. It's one thing for the Methodist Church in Britain to say, we will take episcopacy into our system. We are quite happy to have bishops, and we're quite happy to have those bishops as the people who preside at our ordination services. But what does that mean for the ministry of those who are ordained before that happens? The proposal of the scheme that was brought before the two churches in the 1960s was for a service of reconciliation, not of reordination, and then for a two-stage journey to unity, a time of two churches in full communion, and later a single church. There were vociferous opponents in both churches, but the proposals were voted through the Methodist Conference with the required majority, but they failed to get the 75% majority they needed in the General Synod in 1972. And if you'll forgive me a personal anecdote, years later I was privileged to meet the Archbishop at the time, Michael Ramsey, who was speaking of his disappointment some 12 years or so later that that had not happened. I asked him why, and he said that there was a number of reasons, but one he felt was that perhaps the pace had been forced. 50 years on, I'm going to struggle to tell you that the pace has now been forced. In 1994, the Methodist General Purposes Committee and the Anglican Council for Christian Unity agreed to begin talks again. And those informal talks led to a report in 1996 urging formal conversations, a report called Commitment to Mission and Unity. Those formal conversations resulted in the formulation of the Anglican-Methodist Covenant of 2003. A covenant that declares, we, the Methodist Church of Great Britain and the Church of England, on the basis of our shared history, our full agreement in the apostolic faith, our shared theological understandings of the nature and mission of the Church and of its ministry and oversight, and our agreement on the full goal of visible unity, as set out in the previous sections of our Covenant Common Statement, hereby make the following covenant. We do so in a spirit of penitence for all that human sinfulness and narrowness of vision have contributed to our past divisions, believing that we have been impoverished through our separation and that our witness to the gospel has been weakened accordingly, and in a spirit of thanksgiving and joy for the convergence in faith and collaboration in mission that we've experienced in recent years. Following that are 7 affirmations and 6 commitments. And of course, this being church work, they then set up another implementation group that reported in 2005 and again in 2008. And that group finished its work in 2014. And it finished its work in a report called Challenge of the Covenant that made 3 recommendations. It recommended that locally Anglicans and Methodists use all the opportunities that they have for working together, feeling that there are already provisions in the constitutional practice of the Methodist Church and in the canons of the Church of England that enable much more sharing than is commonly going on. And that work is overseen by the Methodist Anglican Panel on Unity and Mission, MAPAM. Also, it set up something called the Joint Covenant Advocacy and Monitoring Group, which looked to create structures and to champion the covenant, and also to foster conversations with Anglicans outside England in the British Isles. And it led to discussions on episcopacy and interchangeability in what came 4 years later to be a report called Mission and Ministry in Covenant. There are two key pieces of work that Mission and Ministry in Covenant sought to address. To share the ministry of the historic episcopate as a sign of the apostolicity of the Church of God, and to welcome all presbyters or priests serving in either church as eligible to serve in both churches. Again, we return to this question. What about those who are not episcopally ordained? Broadly speaking, this is the nub. If those who have not been episcopally ordained are ministering in both churches without having hands laid on them, then the question might be asked, why change the system? Why change the oversight at all? On the other hand, if they are not permitted to minister, what's that saying about their ministry? Is it denying that they were ministers before the moment of coming together? The conclusion that Mission and Ministry in Covenant proposed was what it called, I love this phrase, a bearable anomaly. That for a period of time there would be non-episcopally ordained Methodist presbyters who would exercise ministry across both churches. We'd just live with it because this was only going to be a temporary situation. The report was offered to the Council and General Synod, Methodist Council and General Synod in 2019. And following those conversations, there was more work identified as needing to be done. Liturgies had to be prepared so we would know what future ordination service looked like. There was a proposal to organise a forum to bring the two churches together to discuss their future. There was to be the drafting of a reconciliation of structures. There was to be more work done about the role of deacons in the church. The General Synod debated it, voted it through, but with some hesitation and with a longer timetable. The Methodist Council questioned whether actually anybody was saying this was the priority on which we should be working at this moment. And that's the point we've reached. And effectively, that's why we're stalled. Doesn't mean it won't happen. We're still in a place where we know we've got to solve these issues, and I believe we're still in a place where there's a general desire for unity. A general desire for unity is evidenced by the fact that there are something like 450 or more local ecumenical partnerships with Anglicans and Methodists in them. Not all single congregations, and some with other denominations as well. But a significant number of Methodists and Anglicans are worshipping together Sunday by Sunday. And also, we have now the new group Living in Covenant that has a threefold role: to enable us to have better understanding of the distinctive gifts of each of our traditions, to highlight good examples of things that are happening and encourage more, and to foster spiritual relationships. So we continue in hope. Sorry, I've gone the wrong way. As the Methodist Church's officers will continue in their peregrination to Tavistock Place. Tavistock Place, the advertising brochure for this property told me, is in London's Knowledge Quarter. It's close to the British Library, it's close to the British Museum, it's close to the University College. But we might also say it's in the Ecumenical Quarter. Churches together in England have their offices at 27 Tavistock Square, just around the corner, as does the Free Churches group of churches together in England. The United Reformed Church has its offices in Tavistock Square as well, and the Quakers are based at Friends House on Euston Road. So part of our journey there is going to be being closer to some of our other ecumenical partners, particularly in the free churches. There's a very helpful chapter by Martin Wellings in a book published last year on Anglican-Methodist ecumenism that Martin co-edited with Jane Platt, in which he talks about the long view of relations with the Church of England. And in that, Martin recognises that the free church dimension of Methodism's life is essential to us understanding our long view. Is Methodism a free church? We are not, as Methodists, a dissenting tradition. But we are key, I think, to the identity of the free churches in England. In fact, I would argue that the free churches in England as they are partly as they are because of Methodism. And part of the separation of Methodist Church from England, from the Church of England in the 19th century, was the catalyst of the growth of the free churches. 19th century is the century of non-conformity. Look at the architecture of any of our major cities, and you'll see just how many large non-conformist Protestant denominations there were building and building rapidly at that time. And Methodism was a part of that movement. But, believe it or not, we're not living in the 19th century. The free church landscape has changed. Earlier this year, I was at the induction of Methodist presbyter Helen Cameron as moderator of the Free Churches group. The first time we've had a Methodist as the moderator for some time. Because the days when the Free Churches were almost exclusively the United Reformed Church, the Baptists and the Methodists have long since gone. There are now 26 denominations within that Free Churches group. And churches together in England is not just Roman Catholics, Anglicans and Free Churches any longer. It now has three other traditions that it's identified. The Orthodox, growing in numbers in this country, the Pentecostal tradition have their own group, and then there's a group that CTE calls the Fourth Presidency, who are the churches that have a considerable presence outside these islands and include the Lutherans and the Society of Friends. The URC has been one of the Methodist Church's major ecumenical partners throughout its existence in the last 50 years. Interestingly, you'll note, it came into being through the union of the three older Protestant denominations in the same year as the Anglican-Methodist unity proposals were rejected by the General Synod. And it's important for us to acknowledge that the Anglican-Methodist covenant was never intended to foreclose other relationships. There were always URC observers in the Joint Implementation Commission. In fact, our belief throughout has been that widening the ecumenical family, part of the purpose of the Anglican-Methodist covenant should be to widen the ecumenical dialogue. It should be a way of which we promote wider unity, not that we draw away from it. I was fascinated to be in some of the conversations around the work of Mission and Ministry and Covenant with Welsh representatives. In Wales, when they talk about the covenant, they talk about a covenant of 5 partners, not just of 2. And in all our conversations as Anglicans and Methodists going forward, we need to bear that in mind. So where does all that leave us? Well, of course, it's easy to be pessimistic. If we've been trying to do this for 50 years, since the failure of the scheme, or 75 years since Archbishop Fisher, or 100 years since the Lambeth Appeal of 1920, is it likely to happen? And at present, it seems the sexuality debate is the priority for many. How many, I wondered, shared my frustration that the goals seemed to have been so near being achieved and yet missed so often over that period. And then I went to the British Library to do some work on this and discovered that my ticket for the British Library was out of date and had to go and renew it, and got into a sharp conversation with somebody in the Reader Services room. Had I remembered that you were streaming this tonight, I might have given him the link, because he asked me about my work and said he was an Anglican. And he said, Anglican-Methodist unity, why hasn't that happened yet? Why hasn't that happened yet? I won't try to speak for the Church of England, but if it is to happen, it seems to me that there are 4 things that we as Methodists need to be concentrating on to take the conversation forward. And I think the first, and this is a personal opinion, the first is that we have to be honest about our history. My interlocutor at the British Library said, of course, John Wesley never wanted a separation, did he? And that's a common perception, and it's not surprising. Both the Wesley brothers maintained to the end that they were Anglicans. But in 1784, John Wesley signed a deed of declaration that continued the work of the Methodist societies after his death and established the Methodist Conference with the Legal 100, continuing the work in an organisation that could barely, I think, be accommodated in the Church of England. He established, he edited in 1784 also a new service book for the American Methodists, and he reduced the number of articles of the Church of England in that book. And he ordained people for the work in America, all 3 of which might be seen as undermining his commitment that Methodism remained within the Church of England. And our history has been complicated. There's been a number of issues, ways in which we have moved at different paces and in different directions over the time since the 1780s, on lay presidency at the Eucharist, on our understanding of deacons, on liturgical practice, on some theological issues. We can name them, and we need to own our history. And what we also need to do is to admit that at periods in our history, reunion has not been our priority. There have been times of suspicion, there have been times of competition, there have been times of distrust. The service of reconciliation that was proposed in 1972 and again in 2018 isn't just about reconciling ordained ministry. It's about a whole host of things where we have to acknowledge that we need one another's forgiveness when we have not been the people seeking unity that we should have been. The second thing I think that we need to do as Methodists is we need to articulate the vision of what it is that we hope to achieve. In its response to Mission, Ministry and Covenant, the Faith and Order group, the Anglican group, suggested that it was a moment to explore what we mean by full, visible or organic unity. Interchangeable ministry is a part of visible unity, but it doesn't mean that visible unity will automatically follow. And it will be interesting to look across the Irish Sea. The Methodist Church in Ireland and the Episcopal Church in Ireland came together to ordain the president of the Methodist Conference in 2014, establishing the presidency of the conference as an Episcopal minister, a step on the road to unity. But we'll wait to see how far that takes us towards what the unity is, which into the world described as mystical, visible, and missional. Unity that is spiritual and grounded in the prayer of Jesus in John 17, that is visible, that is witnessing to the unity that is Christ's intention, and that is missional, that serves God's purpose in God's world. We need to be clearer about what that might look like. The third thing I think we need to do as Methodists is we've got to answer the question that we failed to answer in the mid-noughties. What sort of bishops do we envisage ourselves having? The debate ran into the sand then, some of you may remember. The conference was presented with a number of options as to what episcopacy and Methodism liked, added the last one, which was none of the above, went out for consultation, and the consultation proved to be ineffective and indecisive. We have some key questions we have to answer. What does personal episcopacy mean for us? We agree that we're a church and that we have episcopal oversight, but that oversight is exercised by the conference and represented by the president. The president's ministry in ordaining and other matters continues beyond their year of office. And yet our presidency is the president and the vice president. Our college, as it were, of presidency includes the past vice presidents and the past presidents. How does that correspond to the College of Bishops in the Church of England? It's a question that we need to explore and to which we need to give some answers. And finally, we have to think about dioceses. There's a conversation going on at the moment about the academization of primary schools. We have a number of Methodist Anglican joint primary schools around the country, and the question that has come is to which academy will they go? Because it's likely that dioceses will form academy trusts and the Methodist Church will form one or more academy trusts. Indeed, we already have one academy trust. But, of course, the conversation is between the Methodist Church nationally and the diocese, because the diocese is the unit that deals with those matters, as it so often is. Paul Avis argues that the diocese in Anglicanism is regarded ecclesiologically as the local church. He goes on, there are two fundamental expressions of the church in the Anglican view, the universal and the local or the diocesan. Provinces and parishes, therefore, are contingent. Methodist Church in Britain has four levels of structure that are passed. We have the connection, we have our districts, we have the circuit, and we have the local church. And often we talk about the circuit as the base unit of mission and about our being connectional as being key. For example, in the deployment of our ministers, we station to circuits, but we do that connectionally. And yet our connection and our circuit roughly correspond to the province and to the parish or the deanery, not to the diocese. Our view of districts, at least since Methodist Union, has to some extent viewed them as being provisional. So could it be that this is something that we as Methodists need to explore? And perhaps, given that the conference last month decided not to accept the proposals on district reconfiguration, perhaps we have an unexpected opportunity here. We could do ecumenical work around this. I am not suggesting for one moment that Methodism is looking to become a diocesan church. But I am suggesting that as Methodists, we need better to understand what the role of the diocese is within the Church of England, why the diocese is important as a unit, and how the ministry of the bishop as the symbol of unity in the diocese is key to that understanding. And if we're able to do that, and get a better understanding of the role of the bishop, perhaps we'll be able to better answer our own questions about bishops. Perhaps, if we're able, and I think the work that's being done in Cumbria at the moment in a united ecumenical area may be a sign of this, perhaps we might be able to start to get a glimpse of what a united church might look like. Perhaps, if we better appreciate the role of the diocese, we might, as Methodists, be less glib about John Wesley's claim that the world was his parish and that he didn't need episcopal authority to preach anywhere. Or perhaps that last point is going too far for the Secretary of the Methodist Conference to say. The sense of mission that John Wesley captured in those famous words is one of Methodism's gifts to the ecumenical endeavour. It was the missional priority that led to the actions in 1784 that might not in themselves have been determinative of separating from the Church of England, but symbolically might now look as though they were. It remains my hope that one day we'll be able both to harness that missional energy and be one church that comprises both Anglican and Methodist children of the 18th century. And it remains my hope that that day will not be long delayed. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for that overview of a very long conversation that has been going on, and the perspective that you've given of some of the work that the Methodist Church will still need to do as part of that conversation. We're going to throw it open now for questions. So if you do have any questions, Stacey will come to you with a microphone and take your questions. We would encourage, I think, some short questions and questions rather than lengthy statements, if possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan, for a fascinating talk, and I think we've all learnt a great deal this evening. Clearly, since COVID-19, there's been a great impetus for change. In many of our churches, we've seen a lot of decline, a lack of volunteers, financial difficulty, closure, etc. I wonder if you've got any perspective on whether that adds impetus to the conversation about unity.
Thank you. I think it's a difficult one to answer, and I think it may cut both ways. I think in some ways, the decline of denominations, and I think if we're honest, actually, the impact of COVID has simply accelerated trends that were already in place before 2020. The impact of decline can be to draw churches back into themselves. So actually survival becomes the key thing, actually. And the ecumenical dialogue is one more thing that they do not have the time to do any longer, or the energy to do any longer. The other way it might cut, though, is actually it might force the question. I mean, how many parishes in this country are there where there are still Methodist chapels and Anglican churches with small numbers of worshippers in them at the same time on Sundays? And how many of those places are already actually coming together in some ways informally? One of the things that I was aware in my time when I was a Methodist superintendent in Lincolnshire was that some Anglican parishes had almost become de facto LEPs. That there were Methodists who would worship in their parish churches, often actually because it's a sparsely populated area and we were very short of Anglican clergy, services weren't held every Sunday. So once a month, Methodists would go to the parish church. 3 Sundays a month, they'd travel into the town where I was based in order to worship in the Methodist church. Now, isn't that what Mr. Wesley wanted anyway? Wasn't Wesley's aim, actually, that Methodists should also be communicant members in their parish churches and attend the Methodist meeting? So it's just possible, actually, that we might see things happening naturally. I think it's too early to say.
Thank you for this wonderful talk. And I just got an observation because myself, my interest is in the history of architecture, and as part of that, I've been sort of looking into the history of Coventry Cathedral, which has this wonderful story, actually, of Christian unity, and has even the architectural expression to it, having a dedicated chapel to it. But what is interesting that the whole history of that creation of the cathedral, over 2 decades it took to actually materialize, is that that has always been underlined by a dividing line between them. So when the competition happened, they were saying that our cathedral, even if it accommodates this place of joint ministry of Methodists and Anglicans and Free Church, that the cathedral has to retain an Anglican ethos and retain a Church of England. So we find it kind of interesting because this is sort of it's now a symbol of reconciliation and unity that the Coventry represents. But in its birth, there was always this division coming from, in this case, from the Church of England, actually from the Archbishop. And I just wonder what you sort of view on this from a historical perspective in terms of the Church of England's side in this journey.
I think it's very difficult for me as a Methodist to answer that. I was in Coventry actually was it September, where the Methodist Church has a modern art collection, and we exhibited it in Coventry, and I was there for that. And the sense of hospitality at Coventry has always been key to that. And we had both the Dean of Coventry and the Bishop of Coventry speaking at the Methodist Conference in Birmingham last year, when we were there. I think hospitality is the key, actually. I think, you know, I don't, and by and large, actually, the cathedrals I've found have been very generous in their hospitality. I mean, I think sometimes it's quite easy to look back over the history of the Anglican-Methodist conversations with pessimism and not notice some of the significant things that have changed over the last 50 years. And one of them has been the ecumenical canons. I mean, most cathedrals now have some ecumenical canons, often Methodists amongst them. So I think that sense in which the cathedral is able to offer in many ways as a place of hospitality and a place of, in some ways, recognizing and valuing ministries, actually can be key in that. I'm not sure that answers your question, but certainly that's how I see it.
Yes, I was just reflecting, and it might sound a bit cheeky, but it's not meant to be. But I mean, do we actually need to pursue this? Do we actually need to have people labouring over how to bring things together when on the ground, you know, we're all friends and we're all worshipping? And I just think, couldn't the resources be better spent by actually seeing where people come together, where they are, and not worry about any of the other stuff? I mean, surely the main thing about mission is that on the ground it's happening. And I can't see that the advantages, given that we're all friends together and we have Christians together in Canterbury, and as an Anglican lay reader, I move very happily liturgically between traditions, although of course it's not sacramental for me because I'm not ordained. But, you know, so why do we need to have this? I hope that doesn't sound offensive.
No, it certainly is not offensive at all. I think it's a really good and really important question, and it's one actually that a number of places have answered effectively. One of the things that has happened, I think, generally in our ecumenical work in Britain over the last 20 years, certainly, has been that the focus of churches together groups has been much more on what we can do together in mission than actually on trying to solve the problems and create structural unity. I think there are two reasons why it matters. Certainly why it matters to me, and why I think it should matter to the leadership of both churches. One is that we like to think that we're all friends. Sometimes, actually, our good ecumenical relationships have depended on personalities to a significant degree. And it can take a change of ministry in the Methodist Church or a change of incumbent in a parish actually to put back work that has been done. And actually, if you know, so one of the things we'd hope to do, I think, would be to lock things in so they cannot be undone. The other is that there comes a point where you can't do everything together, and where actually the division becomes visible. So you know, you might have you know, a series of missional activities, but if actually there's some reason why for some things it has to be an Anglican who does something, or an Anglican is not able to do something in one place, then at that moment, you know, the work of mission in proclaiming the unity of Christ's kingdom actually is undermined by the division being apparent. So those two reasons, I think it does matter. We've got to get it right.
Thank you, Jonathan. I was, for a number of years, the Canterbury Diocesan Secretary. So I think we share the experience of being regarded by some others as inhabitants of the Kremlin. it was Rowan Williams who actually described Diocesan House in Canterbury as the Kremlin on his first visit. He's supposed to be a wise man. A relatively simple question. You talk about the Methodist Church facing schism over sexuality. The Church of England certainly faces schism. Shouldn't we put everything on the back burner until we actually worked out whether that's going to happen? Because we may try to be putting together churches which don't exist.
There's an argument saying that effectively we've done that. Christian people are marvellous, but we always seem to find something about which we can disagree with one another. And if it's not this, then it will be something else. We are never going to come to a place where actually, there is no risk that an issue will divide one or other of the two churches. I think in some senses we've got to work together, and particularly when actually the issues are the same. It's not, the view that people take about one particular issue won't depend on them being Methodist or Anglican. It might depend upon the broader theological tradition of which they've come. It may depend on the way they read the Bible. It may depend on a number of other things. So there's a number of issues that actually are common to both churches. Would we not be in a better place if we had more room in which to work on these issues together than separately? I just don't. Having said that, I think one of the lessons we learned was that churches have to wrestle with things alongside the ecumenical dialogue. I mean, one of the reasons that Methodism delayed, as I understand it, the ordination of women till the 1970s was because of the Anglican-Methodist conversations that were going on, actually, and it was. So inevitably we're going to move at different paces on different issues, maybe occasionally in different directions on different issues. And at the end of the day, I believe that the Anglican and Methodist churches should come together because I believe that's the will of God, and it's, and therefore, we can't just keep putting it on the back burner.
Thank you. The church that I'm worshipping at the moment is an LEP, an Anglican-Methodist LEP, not very far from Canterbury, and I understand it's one of the oldest in the country. My observations over the last 7 years where I've been there are difficult. I'm old enough to remember 1960s and late 1960s, 70s, and I was in Durham at the time, and I remember the discussions and the angst that people had over the unity conversations at that time. I'd just like your comment. My observations at the moment is that at one level on the ground, things work very well together. And there's lots of initiatives and enthusiasm, but every so often we get stuck. And we get considerably stuck, and I speak of this as a Methodist, and I'm beginning to understand the Church of England. I find it incredibly difficult, but I'm trying. But every so often it's, no, you can't do this. Oh, no, you can't do that. Or we must go and ask for this permission, whatever. And so, yes, you've talked about conversations at that sort of level, and I just hope that they would have some effect at working at that sort of level, but I'd be grateful for your thoughts.
Thank you very much. I think that's a really helpful observation. At the end of the day, if we are able to bring together the Methodist Church and the Church of England, The interchangeability of ministry is one issue, but there are all sorts of other things that could be interchanged, actually. At the end of the day, there's a pragmatic approach that actually says we could simplify structures if we're able to do things together, rather than having, in some cases, as we do now, to get 2 denominations permissions for some things. And if actually those who were worshipping in LEPs were not in any sense different from most other churches of the 2 denominations, if in some sense actually that was the normative was simpler than the complexity sometimes local ecumenical relations makes it, then I think that's actually a gain. I think so. So yes, I mean, I think nationally, if that's the level at which we're looking, it's a good thing. But part of it being a good thing would be that it would have benefits locally. Which does not mean that filling in the Methodist consent form is any easier than filling in an Anglican faculty. So.
I'm aware of that.
I'm thinking on very much the same sort of lines as Rosemary was, because there's a very different history, one could write, of ecumenical activity over the last 70 years. I remember, as a member of a Methodist youth club, a group of us going to evensong at our local Anglican church and being totally bemused because nobody even showed us where to find the correct page in the prayer book. I remember a few years after that having to ask permission before receiving communion in the Church of England. I now, like many other people here, many other non-Anglicans here, very happily receive the Eucharist, both in the cathedral and in other Anglican churches. The difference at grassroots level between the 1960s and the early 70s and now is monumental. I think we're particularly fortunate in Canterbury with the cathedral. I have certainly had stewards in the cathedral say to me, why are there so many Methodists here today? And so you said in answer to Rosemary or to somebody that you thought unity was the will of God. I very seriously question whether institutional unity is the will of God. I think God wills that we love each other and cooperate with each other, but does that actually mean institutional unity?
Thank you. And I agree. I think we know things are different from what they were 50 years ago. And I think that there is a history, but it's a nuanced history actually. And in some ways, actually it will be a history that shows points to convergence that may have happened in the 80s and 90s, actually that haven't been followed through entirely. Institutional unity isn't an end in itself. I think organic unity is. And at the end of the day, rather than answer the previous question, one of the reasons I long for that sort of unity is so that we can't go backwards. Actually, and it will lock in where we've come and give us a base for more.
As there's a gap, I'm just going to jump in with a question that's perhaps picking up on some of the others. So in some of my own experiences of working in ecumenical groups, usually Anglican Catholic, although I'm currently somehow convening a group which is Anglican and Methodist and trying to learn my way through that. One of the things that we've discovered is that it works very well when it's focusing around fellowship and prayer together, maybe even worshipping together, but the minute we want to do anything official, you begin bumping up against all kinds of complicated rules. And you sometimes end up in rather amusing situations where you realise that what you're doing is probably going very close to a line that you probably shouldn't be stepping over. And one of the thoughts I was having, I was wondering what your thinking is would it help the cause for unity if there was a clearer vision of what we would gain by it, particularly in that working together in ministry and mission?
Yes, I think is the brief answer. Yes, I think there, and part of the work that the Joint Advocacy and Monitoring Group was created to do, and Life in Covenant, I hope, will continue, was specifically to look at that and say, you know, what opportunities are there? Actually, what can we see as being the benefits of this? Part of that, actually, I think he's going to be listening to each other, so actually gaining the stories from because, you know, I remember once in a synod complaining that what I thought the ecumenical officer was talking about sounded like postcode ecumenism to me. That your experience will be different in different parts of the country, actually. And if we can harness some of the stories of the best things that are happening, actually, and share the benefits of those, I think it will be hugely encouraging, and might spark further ideas about what might be possible. Yeah.
Can I ask one then? Jonathan, in your presentation you talked about 4 areas that you felt the Methodist Church needed to work on, or the people called Methodists needed to work on. 2 questions then. One, how seriously do you think the Methodist Church is going to respond to those 4 areas? The second question is, what work do you think the Church of England needs to do to shift things forward now as well? We can't just have it whereby it takes 2 for conversation, and it can't just be the Methodist Church that needs to work on some things as well to shift the dialogue forward. So where do you see the Church of England needing to shift as well to help to progress the cause of unity?
Thank you. I think in some ways, actually, there may well be a mirror conversation in the Church of England. So actually, the conversation around, for instance, you know, our history. Actually, I think we need to recognise what's happened in both churches. I think the conversation, particularly around the role of diocese and you know, and actually what the mission. I mean, I think there's part of the corresponding work that the Church of England might want to explore is, what does the ministry of a bishop look like outside of a diocesan structure, over a diocesan structure, or whatever, you know, a broader ministry that we might envisage the President of the Methodist Church having. I'm very reluctant to speak for my Anglican colleagues, as you'll gather. Sorry, remind me what was the first question.
The first question was how serious is the Methodist Church?
Okay. I think we are serious about them. I think it's very easy. It's very easy for the Methodist Church, as it were, to get absorbed into our own internal issues. But I think those are 4 key questions that we do want to explore. I think, you know, I think we know, for example, the question around what sort of bishops. We know that's the question. We know that the issue of episcopacy is the one that we've really got to to deal with. We've got to be quite clear about what we understand it would look like, what it's, we've got to do some exploring on of its benefits. The Methodist Church, does not always, the different Methodists will have different views. My sense is that that there is still, by and large, a lot of goodwill towards progressing this work around the Methodist Church. In some places, it's going to need persuasion that it's more of a priority than some other things. But I think that optimistically, I think the will's there.
Jonathan, in a way, my question is similar to Tim's, I think. When the Anglican-Methodist covenant was being adopted at the local level, I had retired and we were worshipping in Dover. And the ceremony took place in River Methodist Church in Dover. And I remember at the end of this, I spoke to the Archdeacon and I said, I suppose there will now be an extra question on the sort of checklist that the Archdeacon brings to his Archdeacon's visitations. And he said, oh, no, that's the job of the ecumenical officer. I said, well, I've been an ecumenical officer, and I think local clergy would take, and church councils would take rather more notice of an archdeacon than an ecumenical officer. So how seriously, are you taking it? So may I pose a similar question to you, Jonathan? I have to confess that since becoming supernumerary, since retiring, as a Methodist minister, Methodist standing orders no longer feature largely in my devotional reading. So perhaps you can help me. How far do Methodist standing orders reflect that ecumenical imperative?
I think that's a very good question, and I think the inevitable answer is not very far. And there's a reason for that, which is, of course, that the standing orders are about the ordering of the life of the Methodist Church. So there will be, the standing orders are intended to enable people to do things. They're not there in order to proclaim a vision of what might be. There are one or two points, I think, where, let's think. The standing orders are part of our constitutional practice and discipline. Actually, we've been very clear through the Deed of Union that we claim and cherish our place within the Catholic Church. We are essentially a church that looks for the unity of Christ's people. That there are provisions within our model trust to enable things to happen within Methodist churches. What I would be worried, I think I'd be more worried about your question if anyone were turning it the other way and saying, we would love to do this ecumenically, but the standing orders stop us. And I think when we've heard that, we've taken action to amend the standing orders and indeed to expand the provisions of the model trusts. So I don't think they're promoting the ecumenical agenda particularly, but I don't really think that's their purpose. But I'd love to know if people are finding that they're a barrier, then we need to address it.
Jonathan, you talked about, you talked about Methodist presbyters being a bearable anomaly. Is the Methodist diaconal order an unbearable anomaly?
Far from it is the answer, and I think I'm giving that answer both as my immediate response and as the response of those who have been engaged in the conversations. There are questions that we will need to. I mean, one of the pieces of work that has not yet been done has been around the role of Methodist deacons within the interchangeability of ministry. Given that most Anglican deacons are those who are going to go on to be ordained as presbyter, but though there is a growing number of permanent deacons in the Church of England, their ministry is not always seen. It's similar but not the same as I think Methodist deacons. So I think I'd like to think, and I think this was the point where really we'd reached in 2018, 2019, I'd like to think that what we have learned through the Methodist Diaconal Order about diaconal ministry in the life of the Church actually is one of the gifts that we'll bring to the table going forward. It's interesting that we got to that point in the dialogue at the same time as we completed the work on the theology and ecclesiology of the diaconate. So I think I'd want to say quite clearly that our understanding is that the Methodist Diaconal Order is neither unbearable nor an anomaly.
Jonathan, thank you so much for all of that. I'm going to hand over now to Canon Tim Nash from the Cathedral, who is going to come and offer our formal vote of thanks for tonight. So thank you, Canon Tim.
Thank you, Tim, very much, and thank you for the invitation to come and respond to Jonathan's presentation and perspectives. And Jonathan, thank you enormously for all that you have given us. For me, and I suspect for most of us here this evening, this has been a fascinating blend of kind of a reflective review of things that we already knew and had perhaps forgotten, combined with new things that we had never realized and that we're kind of taking on board. And I think that, for me at least, that's a really encouraging and helpful blend that helps us to grow as people, to build on things that we had some perception of and yet get things that are new as well. There were three. I've just pulled out three strands that actually our questions and conversation have already drawn out that I warmed to, particularly in what you've offered us. The first was the theme of personal encounter and how being under one roof, and that was something that was completely new to me. I had no idea that you were moving to Church House, albeit perhaps temporarily, how important being under one roof is. I spent time both as ordinand and as a teacher and as research fellow under one roof with Methodists in Birmingham, and for me that was an expansion and an enrichment of my discipleship of Christ and my following of Christ's way, for which I've always been enormously grateful, and I think people's perspectives have brought that out at the local level. The second thing that I was really grateful for, because it's part of my own background, was your dwelling a little bit on international perspectives and how important that is, that we so often, when we look at unity between the Church of England and the Methodist Church, do so through blinkers created by our own national history. And for me, going to work as a mission partner of the Anglican Church in the Zaire, as it was then called, and that's where I was ordained as an Anglican, where nobody had heard of the Anglican Church. I was completely, qu'est-ce que c'est? une culte. But the Methodist Church had, it was my first encounter with Methodist bishops, and Methodist Church had planes which flew its missionaries and its pastors and its bishops from place to place within the southeastern quarter of Congo where we were working, and that, I think, reminds us of something that we've not, I think, named but talked about, and that's the importance of size. That actually simply, you know, for Anglicans, being the big church in England, one of the larger churches in England, means that I think the temptation for us to ignore ecumenical matters is much greater. And for me, it was you know, a real eye-opener to be in a context where the Methodist and the Brethren churches were the Protestant churches that, you know, were well known, and Anglicans were unheard of, and to have the possibility for that change of perspective, I think, is really important. And the third thing that I think, again, we've referred to is the extent of our internal disagreements, and how odd it is that I think for both churches, most of us can find members of the other church that we find we have much more in common with than a good deal of the members of our own church. I remember, and this is not intended at all as a disparagement of Methodism, but during my own theological training, I was part of something called the Oscott course, where Anglicans and Methodists and Roman Catholics trained together for 2 weeks in Birmingham, the Roman Catholic seminary in Birmingham, which I think no longer exists, was called Oscott House. And we were in small groups of Catholics, Methodists and Anglicans. And as you might imagine, there was a lot of kind of heated debate. But in the group that I was in, all the heat was created by the two Methodists who could not agree with one another on virtually anything. And it was fascinating the way that the Anglicans and the Roman Catholics were kind of mediators for their Methodist brothers. Now, in other contexts, as you well know, I hope, it could just as well have been the Anglicans or the Roman Catholics who were disagreeing with one another. And that, I think, you know, we need to bear in mind as we conduct these conversations. So just three things that I would comment on and have drawn out and I have enjoyed reflecting upon, that you have stimulated. And so we all, I think, are most grateful. It will be different for different people. Thank you so much. I just wondered if we've had a lot of words, and I thought we might have a kind of prophetic, symbolic gesture as part of our closure. You will have guessed that the place where I have been involved considerably in the past is Queen's College, Birmingham. I rather suspect that in Methodism, as in Anglicanism, there is a certain rivalry between theological institutions, and given your Cambridge past, I hope you won't object to this. But I brought two Queen's College, Birmingham mugs, and I have been looking carefully at which glass of water you've been drinking from. I've got to put the microphone down to do this. Can you tell which is the Methodist mug and which is the Anglican mug? No, you can't. So, Jonathan, cheers.
Thank you very much, yes. Thank you, Jonathan, once again for our lecture this evening, and thank you, Canon Tim, for your vote of thanks as well. I'm going to hand over now to our chair of the Contemporary Theology Group, Judith Diamond, who will just give you a few important announcements about next year, as much as anything. So, Judith, over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And, of course, our committee and our meetings here do reflect the joint gatherings of Methodists and Anglicans every month. And so I hope that we're not trailblazers, but at least out there in the front a bit. And we have been for very many years, actually. Really, I just want to bring this to a close very quickly. We really hope you have enjoyed the series. In the committee, we've been quite taken and overwhelmed by the fact that this year we think that the quality of the questions has been amazing. The quality of the talks, of course, we always expect high quality from our speakers, but we've really enjoyed the debate and the questions that have come from our audience, and we'd really like that to continue into next year. I don't think this is going, Joy, this isn't actually going out, is it this? You're not, are you, is this being streamed? Okay, right, well, those that are being online, try and think about coming with yourself next year, and then you can ask a question too. One minor technical thing is that we do need a new web manager. I will explain that in a minute why. We'd be very interested in anyone who themselves could offer to do that, or knows somebody, either Methodist or Anglican, who is willing to take on that role for us. And that leads me into my third point, which is to say a very sad but fond farewell to Joy, sitting there very quietly in the back, very well known to the Methodists, and not so well known to the Anglicans, but Joy is the deacon here, and has been for some years, and is moving within weeks now to take up a very exciting post in Sheffield? Nottingham. Well, I was sorry, I was mistaken about that. But anyway, in Nottingham. And we do wish you all the best, Joy. And you have been the most superb. When I first asked you if it was within your power to set up a web page, which filled me with absolute terror, you said, oh, yes, and went away, and about half an hour later came back with the first sample, and the first sample was so good that we stuck with it. And you've been so helpful, and then when we had then the pandemic, and we had to switch to doing things online, and you're about the only person on the committee that knows what she's doing about this. So we really do wish you all the best, and you go with all our prayers and all our thanks. Me to say we look forward to seeing you all on January the 18th, 2023. Oh, and if you haven't been before, please, but you'd like to know about the series next year, if you could write your name and your email address on the list in the foyer. Thank you.